On the morning of May 27, 1942, a black Mercedes-Benz convertible rounded a sharp hairpin bend on a cobblestone street in a Prague suburb called Holešovice. In the car sat one of the most powerful men in the Nazi Empire. Reinhard Heydrich Reich, protector of Bohemia and Moravia, chief of the Nazi security apparatus, the man who had personally chaired the Wannsee Conference 5 months earlier at which the final solution to the Jewish question was officially systematized, was on his way to the airport. He was heading to Berlin for a meeting with Hitler. He was 37 years old. He was not particularly worried about security. Despite warnings from German intelligence that an assassination attempt might be in preparation, Heydrich traveled with a single driver and an open-top car. He had been told to use an armored vehicle. He had refused. His argument was a statement of ideology as much as logistics. The Czechs were too afraid of reprisal to try anything. His presence in Prague was a demonstration of absolute German power. Armoring himself would suggest vulnerability. And Reinhard Heydrich did not do vulnerability. He was wrong. Waiting at the bend were two men. A 29-year-old Czechoslovak army officer named Josef Gabčík, standing in the middle of the road, and a 28-year-old named John Kubiš, positioned slightly further up the street. They had parachuted into occupied Czechoslovakia from a British Halifax bomber 7 months earlier. They had lived in the shadows of the Nazi occupation, hidden by ordinary Czech civilians who were risking death every day by sheltering them. They had one mission, assigned by the Czechoslovak government in exile in London and approved by British Special Operations Executive: kill Reinhard Heydrich. What happened next in the next 4 seconds, and in the months that followed, became one of the most consequential and most devastating acts of resistance in the history of the Second World War. And the men who carried it out knew, almost certainly, that they would not survive it. To understand the weight of what Gabčík and Kubiš were asked to do, you have to understand who Reinhard Heydrich was. Not just his rank, not just his title, what he was. Heydrich was born in 1904 in Halle, Germany, the son of a musician. He was tall, 6'1", blonde, athletic, brilliant, and possessed of a personal charisma that people who met him almost universally described as deeply unsettling. Not the warmth of a leader who inspires devotion. The cold, calculating intelligence of a man who measured everyone he met for their usefulness and their vulnerability, simultaneously. He had been a naval officer dismissed in 1931 for conduct unbecoming, specifically for breaking an engagement to a woman after seducing her, and then treating her dismissal as a bureaucratic inconvenience. Heinrich Himmler gave him a second chance in the SS. Heydrich repaid it by becoming, in the space of a decade, arguably the most dangerous man in Germany after Hitler himself. He built the SD, the Sicherheitsdienst, the SS intelligence service, from nothing into the most sophisticated and feared surveillance apparatus in Europe. He oversaw the Gestapo's operational direction. He organized Kristallnacht in 1938. He created the Einsatzgruppen, the mobile killing units that followed the Wehrmacht into the Soviet Union in 1941, and murdered approximately 1.5 million Jews, political commissars, and civilians in the first 6 months of Operation Barbarossa alone. And on January 20th, 1942, at a villa in the Berlin suburb of Wannsee, Heydrich chaired a conference of 15 senior Nazi officials at which the systematic murder of every Jewish person in Europe was coordinated and bureaucratically formalized. The Wannsee Conference did not decide that the Holocaust would happen. It was already happening. What it did was organize it, assign responsibilities, establish transportation routes, coordinate the machinery of genocide across every occupied territory. Heydrich ran that meeting with the brisk efficiency of a man scheduling a product launch. The Allied intelligence assessment of Heydrich was stark. He was not just one of Hitler's most powerful subordinates. He was, in the view of British intelligence and the Czechoslovak government in exile, Hitler's most likely successor, the man being quietly groomed to inherit the Third Reich. They called him the Blonde Beast, the Hangman. The man with the iron heart, a phrase attributed to Hitler himself. In September 1941, Hitler appointed Heydrich Reich protector of Bohemia and Moravia, the occupied Czech lands. The previous protector, Konstantin von Neurath, had been considered too soft. Czech resistance was too active. Production quotas for the war effort were going unmet. Worker strikes were slowing the Škoda munitions works, which were critical to the German war machine. Heydrich arrived in Prague and within weeks had broken the resistance networks, executed hundreds of Czechs, deported thousands more, and used a combination of terror and targeted economic benefits to bring Czech factory workers back into line. The Škoda works production improved measurably. He was, by any measure, extraordinarily effective at what he did. He was also, by any measure, the closest thing the Nazi regime had to an architect of genocide in a single human being. The The Czechoslovak government in exile, led by President Edvard Beneš in London, decided he had to die. The operation was given a name drawn from the history of science, Operation Anthropoid. In anthropology, the term refers to primates that most closely resemble humans. The choice of name by the Special Operations Executive, the British organization tasked with conducting sabotage and irregular warfare in occupied Europe, may have been coincidental. It may have been darkly deliberate. What it was not was reassuring. The men chosen to carry it out were not special forces in any modern sense. They were soldiers, Czech soldiers, who had escaped the Nazi occupation and made their way through extraordinary hardship and circuitous routes. Men who had watched their country dismembered by the Munich Agreement of 1938, which handed the Czech Sudetenland to Hitler without Czech consultation, and then seen the rest of Czechoslovakia occupied in March 1939. They were men with everything to avenge and nothing to go back to. Josef Gabčík was born in Slovakia in 1912. He had been an army locksmith before the occupation, a practical man, mechanically minded, physically capable. His escape from Czechoslovakia after the occupation took him through Hungary, the Middle East, and eventually to France, where he fought with Czech forces against the German invasion of 1940. When France fell, he was evacuated to Britain. By the time he was selected for Operation Anthropoid, he had been in exile for 3 years. Jan Kubiš was born in Moravia in 1913. His background was similar, a soldier who had escaped, fought in France, been evacuated to Britain. He was described by those who knew him as quieter than Gabčík, more internally focused, deeply attached to his homeland in a way that was almost physical. Both men were selected partly for their personal qualities, steadiness, reliability, the capacity to operate alone under pressure for extended periods, and partly because they were Czechoslovak, not British. President Beneš and the government in exile were determined that the assassination should be carried out by their own people. The moral and political weight of the act required Czech hands. Both men volunteered. Their SOE training lasted months. Parachuting, weapons, explosive. Tradecraft, how to move through an occupied city, how to communicate without being detected, how to build a cover identity. They trained in Scotland at the SOE Special Training School too. They trained in hand-to-hand combat, in bomb making, in the particular psychological discipline of maintaining a false identity under sustained interrogation. They knew that if caught, they would be tortured before they were killed. They trained anyway. On the night of December 28, 1941, a British Halifax bomber took off from RF Tangmere in southern England. In its cargo hold, among other agents being dropped across occupied Europe, were Gabčík and Kubiš. They jumped into Czech airspace at 2 a.m. They were supposed to land near the town of Pilsen. They landed 30 kilometers off course, in farmland near the village of Nevězdy. The mission was already improvising. From January to May 1942, Gabčík and Kubiš lived in the occupied city. What this meant in practical terms is almost impossible to fully convey. Prague under Heydrich was a city of extraordinary surveillance. The SD had informant networks threading through every neighborhood. The Gestapo maintained files on thousands of Czech citizens. Random identity checks were common. Curfews were enforced. The penalties for resistance, harboring agents, passing information, any form of defiance were death. Not imprisonment. Death, often public, often following torture. The men and women who sheltered Gabčík and Kubiš were not professional resistance fighters for the most part. They were ordinary Czechs, a family here, a church contact there, a network of people connected by patriotism, religion, and a shared hatred of the occupation, held together by the knowledge that if any link in the chain was broken, everyone died. The Moravec family, the Zelenka family, the Fafik family, Bishop Gorazd of the Czech Orthodox Church, names that history has largely forgotten, people who made choices under conditions of terror that most of us will never face. The agents made contact with what remained of the Czech resistance networks already decimated by Heydrich's crackdown. They sent radio messages back to London. They were told repeatedly that the mission was on hold, that London was reconsidering, that the reprisals a successful assassination would trigger might outweigh the strategic benefit. This tension is important. The Czech resistance inside the country was itself divided about the operation. The UVAD, the central leadership of home resistance, had sent warnings to London that an assassination attempt on Heydrich would result in massive reprisals against the Czech civilian population. They were not wrong about this prediction. They argued that the resistance's survival and its ability to feed intelligence to London was worth more than the death of a single German officer, however important. London and Beneš overruled them. The decision was driven by factors that went beyond Czech interests narrowly defined. The Slovak resistance, still formally independent under the Nazi puppet government of Joseph Tiso, needed to be shown that resistance was not futile. The broader question of whether occupied peoples could strike meaningful blows at the Nazi leadership needed an answer that collaboration alone could never provide. And the specific question of Heydrich, his likely succession to Hitler, his direct role in the machinery of the Holocaust, his effectiveness in pacifying Czech production for the German war effort, made him a target whose removal had strategic value beyond the symbolic. The order stood. Gabčík and Kubiš spent those months studying Heydrich's routine. His route to the airport at Holešovice, the bend in the road, the timing, a bend in the road, that was what they found. A hairpin turn on Kirchmayerova Street, now v Holešovičkách, where Heydrich's car would have to slow almost to a stop. A moment of maximum vulnerability in a target whose entire philosophy was invulnerability. They planned for that moment. May 27, 1942, a Wednesday. The day had been chosen because Heydrich was definitively traveling. His flight to Berlin was confirmed. His route was his usual one, and the intelligence suggested no additional security. 3 Czech agents were at the attack point. Gabčík, Kubiš, and a third man, Josef Valčík, positioned further up the road to signal with a mirror when Heydrich's car approached. They had a plan. It was elegant in its simplicity. As the car slowed for the bend, Gabčík would step into the road and open fire with a Sten submachine gun. Kubiš was backup if the Sten failed. He would throw an anti-tank grenade modified with a delayed fuse. At 10:32 a.m., Valčík's signal came. The black Mercedes appeared. Gabčík stepped into the road. He raised the Sten. He pulled the trigger. Nothing happened. The Sten had jammed. The weapon, notoriously prone to mechanical failure, especially when it had been stored in damp conditions, had chosen this moment, of all moments, to malfunction. Heydrich's car had slowed for the bend. Now, extraordinarily, it stopped. Heydrich himself stood up in the open-top vehicle and raised his pistol at Gabčík, who was standing in the road with a useless weapon. His driver reached for his own gun. This is one of the strangest moments in the entire story, and historians have debated it ever since. Why did the car stop? Why did Heydrich, a man who had been warned of assassination plots, who had every reason to accelerate through the obvious ambush, stand up to fight rather than order his driver to speed away? Vanity, arrogance, the absolute conviction that he was untouchable. In that pause, Kubiš threw the grenade. He threw it a fraction too far. It missed the car itself and detonated against the rear wheel close enough that the blast tore through the car's side and sent shrapnel into the trunk. The car was not destroyed. Heydrich, standing up in the open vehicle, was struck in the back by shrapnel and fragments of the exploded seat. He was wounded. He was not dead. He stepped out of the car. He returned fire. Then his legs gave way. He had been hit worse than he initially appeared to understand. He sat on the cobblestones. Gabčík, still in the road, exchanged fire with Heydrich's driver. He shot the driver in the leg, then ran. Kubiš, his face bleeding from the grenade blast, rode away on his bicycle. Heydrich was still alive. A Czech woman named Marie Navarova, who happened to be present, helped lift the wounded Heydrich into a passing vehicle, which carried him to the nearby Belovka hospital. For 8 days, Heydrich fought for his life. The wounds themselves were not, on initial assessment, considered fatal. Shrapnel had penetrated his left side. There was a broken rib, a ruptured diaphragm, and damage to the spleen. German surgeons from Berlin were flown in. Himmler visited. Hitler sent his personal physician, Karl Brandt. The prognosis was cautiously optimistic. Heydrich was in pain but conscious. He was eating. He was giving instructions. And then on the 8th day, septicemia, blood poisoning, set in. The shrapnel had driven foreign material horsehair from the car's upholstery. Fragments of the vehicle's bodywork, perhaps material from the grenade itself, deep into the wounds. In 1942, before the widespread availability of penicillin in German hospitals, a serious infection in an abdominal wound was frequently fatal. On June 4, 1942, Reinhard Heydrich died. He was 38 years old. He is, to this day, the most senior Nazi official to have been assassinated during the Second World War. No other operation by any Allied or resistance force came close to removing someone of his seniority and strategic importance from the Nazi hierarchy. He was given a state funeral of extraordinary pomp. His coffin lay in state in Prague Castle. It was then moved to Berlin, where a procession of SS officers and Nazi dignitaries paid respects. Hitler gave the eulogy, and then the reprisals began. Nazi response to Heydrich's assassination was swift, total, and designed to be unforgettable. Within hours of the attack, Himmler had placed a reward of 10 million Czech crowns for information leading to the assassins. Martial law was declared across Bohemia and Moravia. Mass arrests began. Any Czech found without identity papers after curfew could be shot on sight. Any Czech who had failed to report suspicious persons or activities was subject to immediate execution, along with their family. In the first days after the attack, hundreds of Czechs were arrested and interrogated. Dozens were executed simply on suspicion. The Gestapo worked the city with systematic brutality. And then a letter surfaced. German investigators found a letter that appeared to connect the assassination to a family named Horak, who had relatives in the village of Lidice, located about 15 miles northwest of Prague. The connection was tenuous. The letter was actually connected to a separate, unrelated resistance matter a soldier named František Horak had written to a man named Václav Ziha, who had inadvertently created a paper trail that the Gestapo followed to Lidice. The connection between the letter and the assassination itself was not established. It did not matter. On the night of June 9, 1942, German security forces surrounded the village of Lidice. What happened over the next 24 hours has no word in English adequate to describe it. The 173 men and boys over the age of 15 in Lidice were taken to a farm on the edge of the village. They were shot in groups of 10 against a barn wall. The executioners worked in shifts for several hours. Every man and boy who lived in Lidice was dead by morning. The 84 women of Lidice were taken to Kladno and then transported to Ravensbrück concentration camp. Many would not survive the war. The 88 children of Lidice were taken east. They were subjected to racial assessment, a process in which Nazi eugenicists measured skull circumference, eye color, and other markers to determine which children were sufficiently Aryan to be considered for Germanization. 7 children were selected for this process. The remaining 81 children who failed the racial assessment were taken to a camp in Chemno, Poland. They were killed with carbon monoxide gas, every child. After the executions, German engineers and soldiers demolished the village of Lidice structure by structure. The church was torn down, the houses were torn down, the school was torn down. The cemetery was dug up and the graves destroyed. The stream that ran through the village was diverted. The trees were cut down. The rubble was removed. By the time they were finished, there was nothing left. Not a foundation, not a wall, not a road. They had erased a village from the physical geography of Bohemia. German propaganda newsreels filmed the process and broadcast it across occupied Europe. The message was not subtle. This is what resistance costs. A second village, Ležáky, was destroyed shortly afterward, its 18 adult residents shot, its 2 surviving children taken for Germanization assessment because Ležáky had hosted a resistance radio transmitter. The total death toll of the reprisals directly attributed to the Heydrich assassination through immediate executions, deportations, and the destruction of Lidice and Ležáky exceeded 1,300 Czechs. Gabčík and Kubiš had not been captured. In the chaotic aftermath of the attack, both men had escaped. Over the following days, they were hidden by the same network of Czech families and clergymen who had sheltered them for months. The other paratroopers who had been dropped into Czechoslovakia alongside them, members of other SOE operations, were also in hiding across the city. Eventually, they were given sanctuary in a place that would become the final location of one of the most dramatic last stands in the history of the Second World War, the Cathedral of Saints Cyril and Methodius. A Czech Orthodox cathedral in the Newtown district of Prague, its Bishop Gorazd had been sheltering agents and resistance members. The crypt below the main nave had been converted into a hidden space where the paratroopers could remain, while the city above them was turned inside out by the Gestapo. 7 men hid in the crypt, Gabčík and Kubiš, and 5 other paratroopers from related SOE operations. They were there for 3 weeks. The city continued to be torn apart around them. The rewards for information climbed. The executions continued. The names and faces of the assassins known to the Gestapo from informant descriptions were posted across Prague. On June 16, 1942, a member of one of the other parachuted groups, Karel Čerta, walked into Gestapo headquarters on Bradovska Street. He gave them the names and addresses of the families who had sheltered the agents. The precise reason for Čerta's betrayal has been analyzed by historians at length. Survivors who later testified described him as frightened the scale of the reprisals had broken him. He may also have been motivated partly by the reward money, which was enormous. He was almost certainly not an ideological collaborator, none of which mattered to the families he named. The Moravec family, one of the principal sheltering families, were arrested. Otto Moravec, the young son of the family, was taken by the Gestapo, given alcohol, and then shown his mother's severed head floating in a fish tank. He told them everything he knew, including the location of the cathedral. On June 18, 1942, 3 weeks after Heydrich's death, approximately 750 German SS troops surrounded the Cathedral of Saints Cyril and Methodius at dawn. What followed lasted for 6 hours. The assault began at approximately 4:15 a.m. German troops poured into the cathedral nave. Three of the paratroopers Gabčík, Kubiš, and Adolfo Palka were positioned in the choir loft above. The other four were in the crypt below. The fighting in the nave and choir loft was hand-to-hand and brutal. The paratroopers had weapons, training, and the advantage of prepared positions. But they were 3 men against hundreds. They inflicted casualties. German accounts acknowledged significant losses among the assault force, but the numbers were not survivable. Jan Kubiš was fatally wounded in the choir loft. He died either there or shortly after being removed. The exact circumstances are disputed. Gabčík and Opalka held their positions until their ammunition was exhausted or nearly so. Then they were killed. Below in the crypt, the 4 remaining paratroopers held against a sustained assault that the Germans tried to end by pumping tear gas into the ventilation spaces, then by flooding the crypt through a fire hose brought to the cathedral's windows. The crypt began to fill with water. The Germans brought equipment to break through the outer wall. As the water rose and the wall crumbled, the 4 men in the crypt turned their last rounds on themselves. They were found dead when the Germans finally broke through. None of the 7 men had surrendered. In the weeks and months that followed, the Czech families who had sheltered them were systematically tracked down. The bishop, Gorazd, who had made the decision to shelter the men and had fought alongside them in the final engagement, was arrested, tortured, and executed in September 1942, along with 3 other senior figures from the church. Shurta the informer survived the war. He was arrested by Czech authorities in 1945, tried for treason and murder, and hanged in 1947. And now we arrive at the question that the survivors of the Czech resistance, those who lived, those who lost family members, those who spent years in camps, ask themselves for the rest of their lives. Was it worth it? This is not a rhetorical question. It is not a comfortable one. And it does not have an answer that satisfies everyone who has grappled with it. The case for the prosecution is straightforward and devastating. Heydrich died. In direct response, 300 or more Czechs were killed, deported, or destroyed as part of reprisals. Lidice was erased. Ležáky was erased. 81 children from a single village were murdered with carbon monoxide. The Czech resistance networks, already damaged by Heydrich's crackdown, were further shattered by the wave of arrests triggered by the assassination. The informant Shurta, broken by the reprisals, handed the Gestapo a list of families that destroyed dozens of people who had done nothing except try to protect 2 soldiers carrying out their nation's orders. The mathematics of immediate consequences is not ambiguous. More Czechs died because Heydrich died than would have died in the short term if he had lived. The resistance leaders inside the country who had warned against the operation were correct in their prediction. But the case for the defense is also real, and it operates on a different scale of time and consequence. Heydrich was not just a functionary. He was the most capable administrator of genocide the Nazi regime possessed. His effectiveness in Bohemia and Moravia was not limited to the Czech lands. It was being studied as a model for the administration of other occupied territories. His promotion to higher authority was a genuine near-term possibility. The question of how many more lives, Jewish lives, Slavic lives, the lives of people across occupied Europe would have been consumed by the machinery he was building and perfecting is unanswerable, but it is not zero. His removal introduced uncertainty and disruption at a critical moment in the Holocaust's implementation. The confidence with which his subordinates proceeded after his death was measurably different from the confidence with which they had proceeded under his personal leadership. There is also the question of what the assassination demonstrated. It demonstrated that the Nazi leadership was not invulnerable, that the occupied peoples were not paralyzed, that individual acts of resistance at the highest level were possible. This had psychological and political value that is difficult to quantify but was real. It affected the morale of resistance movements across occupied Europe, it affected the Allied view of Czech commitment to the fight, and it affected the post-war position of the Czech government in exile in ways that shaped the reconstruction of Czech sovereignty after 1945. President Beneš believed, until the end of his life, that the assassination was the right decision. The families of Lidice are perhaps entitled to a different view. Both are correct. That is the unbearable thing about it. In 1945, the German occupation of Czechoslovakia ended. The survivors came home or tried to. The women of Lidice who had survived Ravensbrück concentration camp returned to a field where their village had been. There was nothing there. The grass had grown back over the leveled ground. You could not tell, from looking at it, that 500 people had once lived there, that there had been a church, a school, a brewery, a pond. The post-war Czech government rebuilt Lidice as a new settlement, adjacent to the original site. The original site was preserved as a memorial, A rose garden was planted roses from all over the world, donated by countries and individuals moved by what had happened. Today, there are more than 25,000 rose bushes at Litis. The story of Litis became a global symbol of Nazi barbarism in ways that the Nazis had not anticipated when they filmed the destruction for propaganda purposes. The footage they made to terrorize the occupied peoples of Europe instead circulated among the Allied nations as evidence of what was being fought against. Towns in England, the United States, Mexico, Brazil, Venezuela, Bolivia, and Panama renamed themselves Litis in solidarity during the war. Litis shall live became a slogan of the Allied cause. The Nazis had intended to erase Litis from memory as thoroughly as they had erased it from geography. They created instead one of the most enduring symbols of resistance and atrocity in the history of the 20th century. The Cathedral of St. Cyril and Methodius still stands in Prague's New Town district on Reslova Street. On the lower section of the cathedral's outer wall, on the side facing the street, there are bullet marks. They have not been repaired. The narrow window through which the Germans fed a fire hose into the crypt attempting to flood out the last 4 paratroopers is still there. The memorial plaque beside the entrance names all 7 men. Inside, a small museum in the crypt preserves what remains: personal effects, weapons, the marks of the 6-hour battle. The bullet marks in the wall are the most eloquent thing in the building. They are not a museum exhibit. They are not behind glass. They are in the stone of the building itself, put there by men who were trying to kill 7 other men who refused to be taken alive, and who have been in that stone ever since. Every year, on May 27th, the anniversary of the assassination, Czech officials and the descendants of the paratroopers gather at the cathedral to mark the day. Wreaths are laid, the names are read: Josef Gabčík, Jan Kubiš, Adolf Opalka, Jaroslav Schwarz, Josef Bublik, Jan Hruby, Josef Valchik. 7 men, they knew what they were doing. They knew the likely cost, both to themselves and in the most tragic sense to others. They were not naive. They were soldiers and they were patriots. And they had been given an order by people they trusted. And they followed it with everything they had. Whether that was the decision is a question history has debated for 80 years without resolution. What is not debatable is who they were and what they did, and the fact that the world they died protecting, imperfect, contested, endlessly complicated, is still here. There is a road in a Prague suburb called Holešovice. It turns a hairpin bend where the street was once called Krčmajerova. If you stand at the bend today, the street looks ordinary. There are apartment buildings. There is a tram line. There is nothing to mark the spot except a small plaque, easily missed. On the morning of May 27, 1942, 2 men stood here with the fate of a civilization, their civilization, in their hands. One had a weapon that would not fire. The other threw a grenade that did not land where he intended, and yet, the man in the car died 8 days later from a hospital infection. The village that was destroyed in reprisal became an international symbol of what Nazism was. The cathedral where 7 men made their last stand still stands, with its bullet marks unrepaired. And Reinhard Heydrich, the blonde beast, the man with the iron heart, the architect of the final solution, the most likely heir to the Third Reich, has been dead since June 4, 1942. He is buried in Berlin. His grave is unmarked, to prevent it from becoming a pilgrimage site for those who would venerate it. The Nazis, who understood symbolism better than most, understood that an unmarked grave is its own statement. Gabčík and Kubiš have no graves. They died in the crypt, but they have the cathedral, and the bullet marks in the wall. And the question, the one that cannot be fully answered, the one that anyone who hears this story is compelled to sit with, remains. When the cost of resistance is measured not just in the lives of those who resist, but in the lives of those who had no part in the fighting, who simply lived in a village 12 miles from the city, what do you do? The men who carried out Operation Anthropoid answered the question with their lives. The people of Litis paid for the answer with theirs. Both facts are true at the same time. That is the moral weight of Operation Anthropoid. That is why it has never left us. The word Litis became, in the years after the war, a kind of shorthand for the worst of what the Nazi occupation meant. Not just the military campaign, not just the ideology, but the specific, targeted erasure of ordinary human beings and ordinary human places for the crime of existing in proximity to resistance. 81 children, killed because they lived in a village whose name appeared in a letter found near a man who had been killed because he was the most powerful Nazi official the Allies could reach. The chain of causation is not clean. It never is in war. What is clean is this. The Rose Garden at Litis is one of the most visited memorial sites in the Czech Republic. More than 25,000 roses, donated by countries and individuals, and rose growers and school children, and governments from every part of the world that was moved by the story. The Nazis wanted Litis erased. They got a rose garden instead. That is not justice. But it is something. This story stayed with you if you found yourself sitting with that question, the one about cost and courage and the impossible mathematics of resistance, then you already know what this channel is. It is the place where history does not simplify, where the turning points are real and complicated, and sometimes terrible, and always worth understanding. The next story is already waiting for you. Subscribe so you don't miss it. Hit the bell. And leave a comment with the moment in this story that hit you hardest, the sten that jammed, the children of Litis, the bullet marks in the cathedral wall. Tell me what stayed with you. The past is not finished. It never is.